right. Now that I've kicked the cat off of the desk, welcome to Epidemics. Hope everybody's doing well. All right, for our announcements, this week's quiz is a review quiz, which means it's worth more points than a typical quiz, and it's cumulative. So it can cover all of the material up through the end of today's lecture. And that's due February 6th before midnight. And of course, we have another journal entry due February 6th before midnight. Jerry, were you talking to me? Okay. So there's Nate. When we wrapped up last time, we were just kind of going over some of the basic general epidemiology information. I've got a little bit more to go over today, and then if we get through this fast, we'll start HIV. If not, we'll start HIV next class. So, emerging infectious diseases. This is the term used for new contagious diseases that show up, can cause outbreaks or epidemics. And we get emerging infectious diseases several different ways. An existing disease can evolve into a new disease, and that can be, it can evolve to spread faster. We saw this with the Omicron strain of COVID. It spreads much faster than other previous strains. Existing diseases can also become deadlier. A disease that's not that dangerous can mutate and cause a lot more illness and death. We see this periodically with flu. Every few years, the flu virus is much, much deadlier, and people get a lot sicker. It's not deadly. Well, it is deadly every year, but it's not as deadly every year. We can get an emerging infectious disease if there's new vulnerability in a population. So this can be a situation where an existing disease has spread through a population. Most people got exposed, they have some immunity, but new people come along that are not immune, have not been exposed before. A lot of times this is births. So you have a lot of children born, and once you get to a certain number of vulnerable people, you get another outbreak. And immunity wanes. Just because you have immunity to something this year does not mean that you will have immunity to it forever. When we talk about the immune system later in the semester, we'll talk about how the immune system will remember diseases. Some diseases it will remember for decades. Other diseases, it'll only remember for a year, a couple of years. So you can get the same disease multiple times, depending on how long your immunity lasts. Transportation of a disease into a new population. So if somebody from an area with a disease, like measles, moves to a new area, and say that area has a very low vaccination rate for measles, but they haven't had measles. Well, somebody can bring it in and cause an outbreak. Or somebody can move from an area that doesn't have a disease and has no immunity to an area that experiences that disease. And if enough people do that, they can all get sick. When we think about the history of epidemics, transporting diseases into new populations is one of those things that happens with empire building and colonialism. We'll talk a lot about that when we talk about smallpox, because smallpox was brought to North and South America when the European settlers started moving into the area. And it, combined with measles, decimated the Native American populations. I mean, absolutely horrific decimation of those populations. And the last way we can get a new emerging infectious disease is spillover of zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic is an animal disease that moves into people or can infect both people and animals. There's quite a few of these. There's quite a few diseases that can infect us and can also infect dogs, cats, various other types of animals, farm animals. This is the most common way a new disease shows up. And since the 1970s, about 40 new zoonotic diseases have spread into humans. Yes, ringworm is a great example of a zoonotic disease. Absolutely. When it's a zoonotic disease, there is no way we're ever going to eliminate it. COVID is zoonotic. It infects lots of animals, not just people. So we can try and eliminate it from humans, but humans can then get reinfected from animals that have it. So that's going to be tricky. Jerry, go ahead.
Will this be on Blackboard, this PowerPoint?
It can be.
Because I'm like, am I taking notes or is it on Blackboard for me to refer to it again?
You should be taking notes.
Okay, cheers. Thank you.
Yeah.
You said the scary 4-letter word test.
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, all of this stuff in blue letters, I'm typing that in here. That's not going to be saved in the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Right.
But
yeah, I'm just taking pictures of the slides and then copying.
I was about to say the same.
Take pictures of the slides. Remember, these are also recorded and are available on YouTube.
Oh,
So
yeah.
if you fall behind, you can go watch those videos.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So these zoonotic diseases, sometimes they're pretty mild. Ringworm is not that severe in people who are not immunocompromised. Sometimes they're really bad. Ebola is one of these examples. So diseases like Ebola, there is what we call a reservoir species. That is a wild animal that has that disease, but can survive with it, and therefore spread it to humans pretty easily. Now, with Ebola, we have no freaking clue what the reservoir species is. thousands of species have been checked. Samples have been taken looking for Ebola or antibodies to Ebola. Nothing. We don't know where it lives in between outbreaks. We do know that when there is an outbreak, the outbreak tends to occur in both humans as well as chimps and gorillas. So one of the first early warning signals that there's going to be a new outbreak of Ebola in humans is when the local chimpanzees and gorillas start disappearing and dying. So you might find somebody might go into the wilderness areas in Africa and find a whole troop of gorillas dead. That is usually caused by Ebola. So it kills them in really high numbers, just like it's really deadly to people. Okay, I'm done with this slide.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So this is probably a dumb question, but like when Ebola first emerged in 2014 or 15, I think it was, what like stopped it from becoming like as bad as COVID is? Because like I remember like
that is so not a dumb question. No, dumb questions are things like, do we really need to learn this? Okay, so why has Ebola caused small epidemics and never become widespread?
Yeah.
There are two reasons for this. One is because it is so deadly that it tends not to be transported. When you have a disease that makes people very, very sick early on, it doesn't spread as well. The other is we know how it spreads, and we know the precautions to take to prevent it from spreading. So, I mean, there's always a slim chance that it could get out of Africa. And there have been a few cases of people bringing it from Africa to other parts of the world. But once you find somebody with it, you can isolate them, you isolate the people who've possibly been exposed to it. You do a quarantine of those individuals.
All right. So what you're saying, so like Ebola is a lot more deadlier. So are you saying people like don't exactly have like enough time to spread it?
Yes.
Where COVID like affects you and it's still in like your system for a while?
Yes. Yes. Okay. With COVID, you're contagious within a couple of days of symptoms, and the symptoms start out kind of like a cold or a flu. Plus, it is respiratory, so it spreads through coughing and sneezing and just breathing on people. Ebola has to be contact with bodily fluids. So exposure to blood or tissues of somebody who is infected or their body after death. So one of the biggest ways Ebola spreads in communities is funerary practices. So a lot of people, a lot of cultures, the relatives will bathe the body of their loved one. They'll do the wrapping in the shroud, and they'll actually handle the body. And if that person died of Ebola, then everybody who handled it will get sick.
Oh, okay.
So most of the time, Ebola spreads to healthcare professionals, to immediate family members who have cared for the sick person or who are dealing with the deceased body.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Okay, and I forgot to move this over. So when we talk about emerging infectious diseases, some of them come and go. They just completely disappear. So this is data from 2 years ago. So this was early in the COVID-19 pandemic, March of 2020. And it's comparing several respiratory viruses, COVID, SARS, MERS. SARS and MERS are also coronaviruses. They are related to COVID. And then comparing that to one of the nasty flu outbreaks, the 2009-2010 flu outbreak. So we have cases here. Notice that SARS and MERS have relatively low counts. When we look at these numbers, SARS first appeared in 2002, and there hasn't been a case since 2004. But look at the mortality, almost 10%. This is one of those diseases that kills off the people who are infected quickly and makes it harder for that disease to spread. MERS was even worse. It appeared in 2012, and it had 1 out of 3 people who were infected died from it. MERS does not spread from person to person. It appears to spread from an infected animal to a person. Kind of weird, right? We're not quite sure why that happened. There weren't enough cases to really put a lot of funding into studying this. And the animal that seemed to spread it to people was camels. So if you don't have contact with camels, you don't have to worry about that disease. The current mortality of COVID is about 1.2%. Mortality depends on a lot of things. How many people in the population are vulnerable? What is the quality of healthcare for the population? What is the age of the population? One of the reasons we think that COVID is significantly less deadly in countries in Africa is because the population tends to be younger. They don't have as many old people, especially in areas where they've had a lot of HIV. Okay. So I'm going to very quickly go over the major categories of infectious agents, things that cause infectious diseases.
Can you go back to that last slide?
Yeah.
Was that in it? I remember all of this in the video, maybe.
Quite possibly, yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Let me just get a little snap. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. A virus is, they're really weird things. They're not living. It's genetic material wrapped in protein. I mean, that's it. That's what it is. When they're not infecting somebody, they're just kind of sitting there. They're not doing anything. They don't have any need for energy. They don't create more viruses. None of that stuff. But when they infect your cells, then they take over your cell and use your cell to make more viruses. Like I said, really bizarre. Oops. This term virion is one virus particle. So if I use virion, just want to make sure you know what it is. It's just one virus particle. We call these things obligate intracellular parasites. Obligate, they have to. Intra, inside, cellular, cell, parasites, because they depend on the cell to make more virus to do anything. And it's hard to treat viral diseases. We're getting better at it though. When we talk about bacteria, these are living cells. They're almost always single-celled. Occasionally, you'll get them forming a kind of community, but each cell is capable of surviving on its own. They're very small. Most can be treated these days with antibiotics. But resistance is on the rise. And we have had cases where people have died with a bacterial strain, from a bacterial strain, because there was no antibiotic that worked against it. Bacteria used to be a really big problem before antibiotics. And if we don't deal with antibiotic resistance, they can be a real big problem again. So this is a bunch of individual bacteria cells. This is them growing on a Petri dish. And somebody mentioned ringworm. Ringworm is actually caused by a fungi or fungus. Fungi is just the plural. So fungus, they're living, and they're very common on our skin. So they normally exist on our skin, but they don't always cause problems.
I have another question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So with like ringworm, is it something that can like come, like you can get like more than one, like, so there was this kid, this is kind of gross and I feel so bad for the kid, but in my high school, he was a wrestler, and you know, wrestling the mats, it's like sweaty and gross, and every year he'd get ringworm and he'd come to school with it, and they'd have to kick him out because he'd keep coming to school with it. But like he got it like every year during wrestling season.
Yeah, some people are very prone to getting certain diseases. So yeah, that's yeah, you can get ringworm multiple times.
Okay, yeah, I was just wondering.
Yeah, Nate.
Just to add to that, you're right about wrestling. I was wrestling in high school. I got it just once, but it was a common thing that happened on the team. And like she said, yeah, I think it comes from the sweat on the mats, although we did always mop them up at the end of practice. But I mean, you know, in between that, that's when it happens.
Yep. With fungal infections, moisture is a critical part of it. We think ringworm, we think jock itch, we think yeast infections. We think athlete's foot, athlete's foot. I think I misspelled athletes there. Yeah, I threw in an extra E.
I just had one more question. Well,
Yeah.
this is actually the first question. The last one was a statement technically, but is it true that typically compared to bacteria and viruses, fungal are like the least dangerous? I don't know if you can quantify it like that. but-
Okay, I can answer that. The common fungal infections like ringworm, jock itch, yeast infection, athlete's foot, they're not very dangerous. There are fungal infections that are highly deadly. So it depends on the specific fungus. So if you get a fungus infection in your lungs, that is really, really nasty. And so there's things like aspergillus, which is a very common mold, but if you get it in your lungs, it can cause pneumonia. There's pneumocystis pneumonia, which tends to occur in older individuals and can be quite deadly. These are also more common in people who have HIV or other immune system problems. Most of these are hard to treat. So ringworm can be resistant to antifungals. Yeast infections, those are pretty easy to treat. Athlete's foot, some people just can't seem to get rid of it. You can get fungal infections under your toenails, just really, really hard to get rid of. So generally speaking, the two things that increase, there are three things that increase your risk. Immune deficiency is one, moisture is another. So if you're prone to athlete's foot, walk around your house barefoot. Don't wear shoes constantly. You want to let the space between your toes dry out. But also, the use of antibiotics increases your risk. We have bacteria and fungi living on our skin in a balance. And if you take an antibiotic, your bacteria is going to go down. It's going to decrease how much bacteria lives on your skin. And that can allow the fungus to grow more. And that can cause jock itch, yeast infections, athlete's foot, those sorts of things.
So wait, I'm just sorry. Because when I take notes, I have to be like really specific.
No worries.
I'm confused. So moisture and antibiotics, do they have anything to do with each other? Is that like?
Moisture and antibiotics both increase the risk of fungal infections.
Do you think you could write that? I'm sorry. It's just,
Yeah.
I like to take pictures and then do them later because if I try to write them all down during class, I'll get lost.
Oh,
Absolutely.
hey, no worries.
Thank you.
So antibiotics don't fight bacteria. They help them.
They fight bacteria, but not fungus.
Oh, I'm foolishly coupling them together.
Yeah,
I see.
fungus is not the same thing as bacteria.
I see.
Okay.
And before you go to the next slide after, can we go back to the last one so I can snap that one? I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course, my notes will be gone.
Oh, well, forget it. Okay.
Okay, snap this one.
Jerry, I can email it to you.
That would be very nice of you. All right. Does anybody have any idea what this is a picture of?
The eye behind it specifically, and I think that's the optic nerve.
Yes, good job, Nate. This is a picture. This is a photo of an eye. There's your optic nerve. This is a parasite. So when we talk about parasites, we are talking about animals. Animals. Not bacteria, not fungi, not plants, actual very, very tiny animals. Now, some of them occur outside the body. Things like scabies, head lice,
Crabs.
crabs. Absolutely.
What's that parasite? It's a little explicit, but if you're a guy, you can't like pee in a river because it'll go into your urethra, which is the craziest thing I ever heard in my life.
Yeah. I got some bad news for you.
What?
It's not true.
Really?
Really.
That's good news. It's not bad.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
good news. What are you
It is
talking
good news,
about?
You serious? I swear I saw it from a highly credible place, but cheers.
I think it's one of those things. I think it's like happened one time. And so
Highly
everybody's like,
over-exaggerated.
ah!
It was so scary. That one time was so potent, it scared everyone straight.
Yeah. And it's actually a fish. Very tiny fish that normally lives on the gills of other fish.
Wow.
Oh, I think those are like isopods, right? Like or actually, I don't know. I was watching this video on this type of parasite that like cuts off a fish's tongue and then like
Yeah, I
inserts
saw that. It
itself.
becomes the tongue.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's an isopod. Yep. So yeah,
Crazy little buggers. I feel bad for the fish after seeing that. I was like, oh my God. But apparently they like those isopods like inject like some kind of numbing agent so the fish doesn't even know. I don't know about that last part, may be inaccurate, but I distinctly remember something like that.
I do know that the isopod can then act like a tongue. And so the fish can survive using the isopod the way it would use its tongue.
But isn't it stealing nutrients at the same time? So it's like kind of like a lesser tapeworm.
Yeah. Yeah, you can think of it as that.
That cuts off your tongue.
Yeah. Who needs a tongue, right? Just need an isopod in there. So there are parasites inside the body. We don't have any that eat our tongue, thank goodness. But there are things like worms, which come in a lot of different varieties: roundworms, pinworms, tapeworms, hookworms. And there's also,
Is heartworms just dogs and cats?
it's not people. I know dogs and cats can both get, they're actually different species of heartworm.
Could that ever make a zoonotic jump, you think?
I really, really hope not. I don't know very much about heartworms specifically. Most of the parasites I know stuff about are human infectious parasites. And there's,
And sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. In terms of zoonotic, is that usually just applied to viruses? Because I've never heard of parasites making an animal. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm sure there's some out there.
there are definitely some that you can get from your pet or other animals. And in fact, toxoplasmosis is one of them. So yes, you can get these from animals, you can get these from food. You can get them from eating undercooked pork, for example. Toxoplasmosis, that's what this is. It is a very common parasite. Lots of people are infected with toxoplasmosis. Most people never have any symptoms. This is one of the things about parasites. If you have one tapeworm, you may never have symptoms. If you have a dozen tapeworms, then we have a problem. So a lot of us can survive with a low number of parasites without severe health consequences. Not all parasites, not all people. A lot depends on your nutritional status. So if you struggle to get enough food to eat, then even one tapeworm can be a problem. Toxoplasmosis, not usually a problem, except, again, people who have immune system problems, HIV positive is what we tend to think of, people on chemotherapy, older people, all of these categories are more susceptible to toxo, and pregnant women. Toxoplasmosis comes from eating undercooked meat, undercooked shellfish, and cleaning your cat's litter box. So if you have cats that are strictly indoors, they never go outside, they probably do not have toxo. But if your cat ever goes outside, it probably does have toxo. And what can happen if a pregnant woman gets infected with toxo, it can go into the fetus. And if it goes into the fetus, it can end up in the eye like this. It can end up in the brain. It can cause major problems for that developing embryo. And of course, malaria is a parasite. And we're going to talk a lot about malaria. Malaria, we've eliminated it from a lot of places, but it still kills over 600,000 people every year, mostly children.
Is that in the US or overseas?
Worldwide. Malaria is not currently found in the US.
It's carried by mosquitoes, I believe, right?
Yep.
India, then it's a lot of mosquitoes in India. And
I think Africa is the biggest center for malaria. I could be wrong.
Yeah, Africa has a lot of malaria, and it has, well, we're gonna have a lot of discussions on malaria. In Africa, there's multiple versions of malaria, and the deadliest version is found, I think, exclusively in Africa. Malaria is also found in Central and parts of South America. I'm pretty sure some parts of Southeast Asia also have a lot of it. It used to be widespread. It used to be in America, including Massachusetts. But we eradicated it from the US. And we'll learn that story when we talk about malaria. Okay, picture time. All right. And the last kind of contagious disease I want to talk about are prions. Okay, if you thought viruses were weird, prions, there's no genetic material here. They are just protein. And they are not, okay, they're not usually spread from person to person. You have to get these from something you eat. So you can have a genetic mutation that causes these proteins to occur. They're just malformed proteins. So they're proteins that normally exist in your brain that instead of having the normal shape, they have an abnormal shape. And with proteins, the shape is critical. If they're not the right shape, they're not going to function correctly. So you can have a genetic mutation that causes these abnormal proteins to occur. But we also think about this with mad cow disease, chronic wasting disease in deer and elk. So the big outbreak of this was when this disease got into cows in the food chain. And then it got into the diet because cooking does not destroy these proteins. So you can cook your food and still get them. As of now, it is not in the food chain in the US. There are deer and elk in the US that have chronic wasting disease. You are not supposed to eat venison from areas that have those diseases. It's not, to the best of my knowledge, it's not in New England right now. So if you like to hunt and you hunt in New England, you're okay. Nate.
So it may sound redundant, but I guess it goes without saying that effectively cooking said venison at a high temperature has no effect on this prion whatsoever.
You are correct.
Sad.
Yeah, scary. So this is normal brain tissue. And this is brain tissue. You see these holes in the brain, these white circles? That's what we call spongiform changes. Yeah, don't worry about this term, but sponge form. It looks like a sponge. And then this is a slice of, it looks like a human brain of somebody who had one of these prion diseases compared to a person's brain who did not have it. So you can see that a lot of the tissue's just gone. So it causes a lot of neurological problems. It is 100% fatal. There's no treatment that does anything for these diseases. But fortunately, they're rare. Okay, you can take pictures now.
I took microbiology last semester and we touched nothing on prions, like just a little. Other than that, they're proteins. Why can't they be cooked off? Why don't they become like denatured through cooking?
That is such a good question. If you can figure that out, you'll earn a nice PhD. We haven't been able to figure that out yet. Yes, most proteins are changed by the cooking process in a way that, you know, you wouldn't be able to catch it. This particular protein survives cooking, it survives the digestive process, and it gets to the brain. We really don't know why or how.
Is this something that can be tested in the meat before it's like consumed to know that these prions are present?
To a degree, yes. Really what we're doing, we're really doing a couple of things to keep it out of the food chain. Starting with, we are not feeding cattle, sheep, because this can also occur in sheep. We're not feeding those animals the remains of other animals. This became a problem when people were taking animals that died so they in such a way that they couldn't sell them for food, and using them to increase the protein in cattle feed or sheep feed. And so that's how it got into cattle in the first place.
Sorry for the abundance of questions. This is rather new and interesting to me. I take it pigs too, since they're fed like slop and just don't eat anything.
I have not heard of this in pigs.
So I have a question. So vultures, right? They have the best, strongest, like digestive system on earth. Maybe crocodiles as well, because they can digest horns, which is damn near impossible to digest. Mm-hmm. Well, you may not know this, but I'm wondering how their digestive juices, which are very strong, you know, interact with this prion.
I do not know. I suspect that they just are not susceptible to these diseases. I've never heard of a prion disease in any type of animal except mammals.
Okay.
So I think they just can't, like I said, I've just never heard of it in a bird or a reptile. Any other prion questions? These things are just bizarre. All right. Now we're going to move on to HIV. So, the story of HIV.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So you can live with AIDS now, right? You can have like a full life, or at least like better than it
HIV.
was.
Yes. If you can afford the medications, yes.
Well, because I was watching a commercial the other day, and it was one of those medicine commercials, and there's like a pill in the drugstore now that you can take, and like it prevents you from spreading it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We will get into all of that. But yes, in the United States, we have access to medicines that can allow somebody who is HIV positive to live probably a normal lifespan. We've got people who've lived decades with HIV at this point. These medications are not available everywhere in the world. And if you've already progressed to AIDS, I don't think they help. They can extend your life expectancy, but once it's progressed to AIDS, that's the ticking time bomb. It's just a matter of time at that point. So HIV is the virus. AIDS happens when your immune system reaches a specific point where it's barely functioning. So if somebody is infected with HIV, we say they are HIV positive. AIDS is when the immune system is starting to fail. And at that point, there are lots of what we call opportunistic infections. Things that normally would not be a problem in somebody with a healthy immune system, but they can attack somebody whose immune system is not functioning and kill them. Before we get started here, we're going to start with some of the history of HIV, and then we're going to move on to some of the biology. And I need to warn you, this is not a pretty topic. The story of HIV and AIDS has a lot of homophobia. It has a lot of discrimination. There is a major role for colonialism in this story. Forced prostitution in this story. So we're going to be talking about a lot of unpleasant topics. If you need a break, take a break.
Have you ever seen the movie with Tom Hanks? I think it's Denzel Washington. It won a bunch of Academy Awards, Philadelphia.
I have not.
It's really good, and it really focuses on the discrimination and homophobia that was like when AIDS first was like became I don't know how to describe it, but it's really good.
Yeah. My experience, I spent 5 years working as a virologist, specifically on HIV. So I've got that experience. I know a lot of the early HIV researchers and the people who came up with some of the early HIV medications. So I know those people. My mom knows those people. So I've got lots of stories from the early days. I'm old enough to remember the early days of this. So I want to read you part of the prologue to a book called "And the Band Played On." This is, at the time, it was a best-selling novel about, not a novel, factual book about the AIDS epidemic and the early AIDS epidemic. It does have some problems. It's not completely accurate in places, but it really does have some good stories. By October 2nd, 1985, the morning Rock Hudson died, the word was familiar to almost every household in the Western world: AIDS. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome had seemed a comfortably distant threat to most of those who had heard of it before. The misfortune of people who fit into rather distinct classes of outcasts and social pariahs. But suddenly, in the summer of 1985, when a movie star was diagnosed with the disease and the newspapers couldn't stop talking about it, the AIDS epidemic became palpable and the threat loomed everywhere. Suddenly, there were children with AIDS who wanted to go to school, laborers with AIDS who wanted to work, and researchers who wanted funding. And there was a threat to the nation's public health that could no longer be ignored. Most significantly, there were the first glimmers of awareness that the future would always contain this strange new word. AIDS would become part of American culture and indelibly change the course of our lives. The latest number that I've heard is 36 million deaths due to AIDS since 1981. It is, last time I checked, one of the deadliest pandemics ever. I think it's either number 2 or number 3. The Black Death still is in first place. Approximately 5% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa is believed to be infected with HIV. And in South Africa and Botswana, the infection rate is over 15%. These are also places where there are not good access to drugs to treat it. Okay. In order to talk about HIV, it is a disease that is transmitted sexually. And so we need to define some of our terminology. And I'm going to start by talking about sex and gender. Sex is what is sometimes called the biological, but it's biologically determined. However, it is not as clear-cut as some people would like to think. It can be defined, you know what, let me go to a whiteboard. I'm going to be writing a lot here. It can be defined by your chromosomes. XX female, XY male. However, not everybody fits into those categories. What about XXY? There's XXX, whoops. There's XYY. It can be defined by production of either sperm or eggs. It can be defined by the genitalia. Vagina, uterus, or penis and testes. It can be defined by what we call secondary sexual characteristics. Things like breasts and beards. Here's the thing. These don't always match. There are people who are XX and have a penis. There are people with a penis and testes that do not produce sperm. There are people who are XY that have a vagina and a uterus. Chances are good you don't know what sex chromosomes you have. Chances are good, unless you have reproduced, you don't know if you produce sperm or eggs. Ejaculate does not always have sperm, and ovulation does not mean eggs are produced. So for this lecture, If I say female, I mean people who are born with a uterus. If I say male, born with penis and testes. Now, there's also gender. Gender is not biological, and it refers to a person's internal, trying to think of a good way to put this. People generally feel like they're male, female, or neither, or sometimes both, kind of internally. And that's what we refer to with gender. And this is usually decided before the age of 5. So by the time somebody's 5, if they say they're a boy, it doesn't matter what their biological structures are, that's their gender. That's what they feel like they are. I will be using the terms men and women. I will also be using the term gay men. That refers to people with a penis who have sex with other men. This doesn't mean strictly homosexual. I'm bringing bisexual in here too. Even though that's not the correct way to describe it, it's just kind of the umbrella term I'm using during this lecture. Okay, take a picture. Going back to the PowerPoint. October 1988, not 1988, 1980, Los Angeles, California. A 33-year-old man goes to the doctor with some strange symptoms. He's had an intermittent fever for 2 months. He has elevated liver enzymes and a low white blood cell count. He's infected with a virus called cytomegalovirus. I'm not typing it, so you don't need to remember the specifics. Cytomegalovirus is a virus that a lot of people have that doesn't usually cause disease. He's also suffering from fungal pneumonia, specifically pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, also called PCP. PCP is another rare disease that's very seldom seen in healthy young adults. He has another fungal infection that's also rare called thrush or candidiasis. And that's a fungal infection in the mouth. Despite treatment, the patient dies. In the next 6 months, 4 other young men, ages 29 to 36, show up at doctors and hospitals in LA with the same strange collection of infections and low white blood cell counts. This is called a cluster. Nate, go ahead.
Just a question, Kaposi, was he like the first known case of that form of sarcoma, or who is that? Is that named after like the scientist that discovered it?
I think it's named after the doctor that discovered it. Yeah. Kaposi sarcoma is it's a type of cancer that is largely seen in people with weakened immune systems. So it had been seen before the AIDS pandemic, but it wasn't very common at that point.
So that's a malignant tumor right there on his skin.
It is a cancer on the skin, yes. Yep.
Could
All
you
right,
have
so
a definition for thrush and cluster?
yes,
Sorry.
not a problem. Thrush is an oral fungal infection,
Thank you.
and I'm getting ready to explain a cluster. A small number of people with similar uncommon symptoms or infections, all showing up in a relatively small area and small time period. So a cluster, sometimes these are just coincidences. We got 7 billion people on the planet. Coincidences happen. But sometimes they're a warning sign of an environmental problem or an infectious disease. And in this case, this cluster was a sign of the beginnings of our awareness of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Okay, take a picture here. All right. So what is HIV and AIDS? HIV is the virus. And AIDS is what's called, is acquired. Nope, it does have a C. Immunodeficiency syndrome. It was originally called a syndrome because we didn't know the cause. Anytime somebody calls a disease or a condition a syndrome, that means it's a collection of symptoms and we don't necessarily know the cause. Although in this case, we're still calling it AIDS now that we know what the cause is. HIV infects and destroys cells of the immune system. And we say it's AIDS when the white blood cell, that's your immune system cells, fall below a specific level. So we can count the concentration of white blood cells from your blood. And once you get below a certain point, then we say it's AIDS. So early on in the infection, only a small fraction of your white blood cells are infected. As the years progress, more and more white blood cells are infected. If you're untreated, you generally people die between 8 and 10 years. Okay, Picture time. All right. This is a different way of looking at a map of the world than you're probably used to seeing. In this example, the continents are actually to scale with each other. People tend to look at this and go, no way, Africa's not that big. Yeah, it is that big. So HIV originated in this part of Africa here where this star is. And it then spread. So here is Massachusetts. Here is Haiti. We're going to be talking about how it went from Africa to Haiti and then to the United States, San Francisco and New York City specifically. But we don't have enough time to really get started with this. So we'll start with the origin of the virus next time. What questions do you guys need me to answer right now?
Is that the Congo?
Yes, that's Congo.
So it's back to my point where they first was making the vaccine for polio was in that same area, in the same area where they reported HIV.
Yes, yes, it is.
Expand on that. So we shall.
We are going to expand on that. Yes.
Oh, today now? Okay.
No, next time.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant.
Yes. We are going to talk about that because yes, the polio vaccination.
How would that be related though? If they're two different diseases that have different effects.
Tell them, Professor.
Yeah, educate me.
They used the same needles over and over again.
But if it was as
So they was testing the polio vaccine on people, right?
right,
Say
but
that
did it come from a monkey? How would it go from a needle to another person if it originated in apes? That's what I don't understand.
they don't have that connection, bro.
Yeah.
That's the
I
connection.
thought it came from SIV, a virus that was found in
does.
apes, monkeys.
It did. We're going to get into all the nitty-gritty details of this next time. So I know you guys are eager to keep going, but we're out of time.
Live another day. No worries.
Yeah. All right.
Take care. I'll see you guys Thursday. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor, did you get